Good afternoon. Welcome to the 14th Annual Art History Symposium. I'm Dr. Ilenia Colón Mendoza. It is my pleasure to welcome you today. I would like to thank you for attending. I would like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Watson, Dr. Zaho, Dr. Geppert, and Dr. Navaroli, who's not here today, and neither is Dr. Geppert, but they did such a good job at evaluating all these papers. So we had a record submission this year of eight papers, and these were the 4 selected. So what you're going to witness is students that have been working on this beyond the classroom. So all the papers today are from Dr. Watson's American Art class, and students then proceed to work very closely with Dr. Zaho. Thank you so much for editing. So lots of the process of editing, and then they practice with me the presentation. So this is a lot of effort on part of these students, and we appreciate your work and your research. Thank you so much. So we have our first speaker. Our first speaker is Amelia Bidding, is a senior pursuing her bachelor's in art history. She is most interested in 20th century modernism, contemporary art, and Latin American art. Amelia is currently an intern at the UCF Art Gallery, where she helps with the exhibition setup, openings, and daily operations. She has previously served as a curatorial intern at the Alpha Art Gallery in New Brunswick, New Jersey, as well as an archives intern at the Plant City Photo Archives and History Center. Working remotely, she has assisted in the curation of 2 exhibitions at the Alpha Art Gallery. In Plant City, she curated and installed a permanent photo collage exhibit in the historic Lee Building. She has also volunteered at several events and exhibition openings at the Orlando Museum of Art. Amelia is dedicated to the study, preservation, and distribution of art and strives to become a professor or a gallery director. Let's welcome Amelia.
So, George Bellow's boxing paintings, From the Underworld to the Spotlight. On September 14, 1923, George Bellow sat ringside in the reporter section of the undisputed heavyweight title fight between the American champion Jack Dempsey and the Argentinian challenger Luis Angel Firpo. He had been commissioned by the New York Evening World, a newspaper, to create an illustration of the event, which he would go on to make a full painting of a year later. The bout lasted only 4 minutes, and Dempsey emerged victorious, but not after being knocked out of the ring minutes into the first round. Bellow's 1924 painting, Dempsey and Firpo, depicts the pivotal moment when Firpo has cast Dempsey out of the ring and into the spectators below. Spotlights illuminate the arena and highlight the smooth musculature of the combatants. Their movements are precise and stiff, and their bodies are rendered with the sculptural and tubular quality. Distinguished spectators gawk at their beloved champion tumbling from the ring. Compared to Bellow's earlier boxing paintings, such as Thagat Sharkey's and both members of this club, Dempsey and Firpo is stiff, shallow, and illustrative. In E.A. Carmian's The Boxing Paintings, from the 1982 exhibition catalog, Bellow's The Boxing Pictures, he cites J. Hambidge's book, The Elements of Dynamic Symmetry, as a vital influence on Bellow's later works. Hambidge's writings emphasize the use of classical systems of symmetry and intersecting planes to create balanced compositions. Carmian concludes his analysis of Dempsey and Firpo by claiming that the change in Bellow's later boxing paintings can be attributed to his introduction to Hambidge in 1921. He fails to recognize that Bellow's rendering of the scene was also influenced by the change in legality of boxing. In his essay, From Dynamism to Objectivity, The Late Career of George Bellow, Mark Andrew White attributes Bellow's stylistic evolution to his introduction to Hambidge's systems, as well as his emerging interest in classicism, and the post-World War II developments in sports journalism and masculine culture. White fails to mention how the evolution of legality of boxing also influenced the style of Bellow's boxing paintings. Through a close examination of Bellow's 6 boxing paintings, I will construct an analysis of the laws and social notions that inform their renderings. I argue that the paintings can be separated into 2 groups of 3 that can be differentiated through their relation to the legal status of boxing. This relationship is reflected through Bellow's inclinations towards grotesque caricature or illustrative idealism. I will highlight Stagat Sharkey's as a representative of the first group and an indicator of the initial ideas surrounding pugilism. I will use an analysis of Bellow's later boxing images as evidence of a transition surrounding the acceptance and legality of the sport in the early 20th century urban New York. I argue that Dempsey and Firpo serves as a manifestation of new boxing laws, positive public opinion, and demonstrates Bellow's ability to develop his style to accommodate these changes. In 1907, when George Bellow attended his first scrimmage at Sharkey's Saloon, the sport had been made illegal in New York State by the Lewis Law of 1900. Matches were mediated through loopholes in private clubs. Associated with violence, filth, and vice, boxing was seen by most as a pastime for unsophisticated men who took pleasure in displays of combat. Most of the notable fighters were immigrants, and the audience was of a similar demographic. Boxing had become a vexed pastime that diverged from the popular ideas that surrounded acceptable sports, such as tennis, baseball, and college football. The violence and masculinity of boxing was at odds with Puritan ideals, but it was also this virility that had made boxing quite popular among many male city dwellers, despite its legal status. In 1907, Bellow created his first boxing painting titled Club Night. In this image, he establishes the conventions he would continue to employ in his next two boxing paintings, Stagat Sharkey's and both members of this club, both from 1909. Stagat Sharkey's is an oil-on-canvas work that is around 3 feet by 4 feet. The scene situates the viewer within Tom Sharkey's bustling yet barely legal operation. The audience space is dim and smoky. The expanse of faintly delineated features is occasionally punctuated by the warm glow of a lit cigar. Two men wrap themselves around the pole on the right of the image, and they hoot and holler at the grand and brutish display. On our side of the stage, a man faces us and directs his arm towards the fighters, whose bodies are illuminated under a harsh spotlight. The energetic red that is dotted on the faces of the audience also appears in the heads, arms, and torsos of the fighters. A burly referee mediates the fight and makes a fickle attempt to pull the two individuals apart. There is no effort made by Bellow to emphasize the identities of the men on stage. Their faces are completely obscured by their domineering exertions. They are reduced to an impasto of vivid flesh and untamed energy. When a comment was made by an observer of the painting about the unrealistic positions of the fighters, Bellow stated, quote, "I do not know anything about boxing. I'm just painting two men trying to kill each other," end quote. The athletes, although they are presented as individuals, are a symbol of boxing as a violent and masculine practice. Stagat Sharkey's addresses boxing as a pugilistic vice and a pastime that was highly controversial through the employment of exaggeration and caricature. Bellow's depictions of an illegal pastime required a method that documented not only the event, but the brutish and murky atmosphere of a sport defined by conflict. Brawlers and rollicking spectators appear in another of Bellow's works from the same year, both members of this club. It is a nearly 4 foot by 5 foot oil-on-canvas work. Most likely another interpretation of memories from Tom Sharkey's Saloon, the composition and atmosphere are comparable to Stagat Sharkey's. Two men protrude through the ropes of the ring to heckle and engage, and the men whose faces are illuminated behind the fighters are rendered with various amplified expressions. A man with a radiant grin is pictured just below the foot of the boxer on the right. Another figure is positioned between the legs of the fighter on the left, whose expression is obscured by smoke, movement, or shadow. The simplified crowd serve as caricatures of the attendees of these matches. They are overjoyed to project their carnal desires onto a stage. Their grotesque features and reactions reflect how the public viewed the onlookers of the prize-fighting spectacle with anything but grace. The two fighters engage in a similar arrangement to Stagat Sharkey's, with one physically overpowering the other. The combatant on the left sports green trunks, perhaps a nod to the Irish heritage of many early American prize fighters. It is proposed by many art historians that the left fighter's face is bloodied, but a similar use of red appears on the faces in Stagat Sharkey's that has been interpreted as the concentration of energy and serves to highlight the violence of the sport and the characterization of the crowd as bloodthirsty. The red paint on the face of the fighter also outlines the musculature on his arms and torso. The right boxer's features are completely undiscerned. His right arm and face have become a uniform mass under the canopy created by the union of the fighter's arms. A departure from the Saget-Sharkey's conventions manifests in the inclusion of a black boxer. The inclusion of a black participant shines light on the fact that mixed-race bouts were not outlawed until after the Frawley Law of 1911, the initial law that made boxing illegal in New York. Additionally, many of the notable fighters during this period were members of recent immigrant groups, which attracted a wide variety of audience members. This influx promoted a mingling of social classes and an atmosphere of fraternity, despite the illicit nature of prize fighting. But even with the inundation of boxing patrons, the sport failed to obtain the prejudice of other popular sports due to the restraining power of Puritan prejudice and the widespread notion that pugilists were surrounded by gamblers, thieves, and social outcasts. Bellow expresses these presumptions of boxing through his inclinations towards obscured and uncanny figures, twisted bodies, and frantic brushstrokes that invoke a feverish and swirling vitality. Grotesque depictions of fighters and audiences define Bellow's earlier boxing paintings and reveal the unsavory opinions surrounding early 20th century prize fighting. The following decade, New York experienced an influx of new attitudes surrounding boxing. Americans of the 1920s were becoming fascinated with the drama and athleticism of athletes and sporting events. Boxing underwent several changes during this period, starting with the Frawley Law in 1911, which made prize fighting legal in New York State. The Frawley Law was repealed in 1917, which made boxing illegal again, but its growing popularity was undeniable. In 1920, the Walker Law was passed, which officially legalized boxing in New York for the second time and facilitated the development of new rules and regulations. Additionally, several developments in American culture surfaced because of the First World War that influenced the conceptions of pugilism. Men had to prove themselves elsewhere and found that this desire could be fulfilled in the ring. Boxing served as an excellent indicator of muscular endurance and mental fortitude. Athletic commissions were created to ensure the protections of athletes and the fairness of the sport. Matches were no longer held in back rooms under dim lights, and they were now being promoted, documented, and attended like any other sporting event of the 1920s. Victorious fighters gained the ability to become respected athletes and even celebrities. It was not until 1923 that Bellow would make his next boxing painting, titled Introducing John L. Sullivan. This work is Bellow's first boxing painting to feature identifiable figures in American boxing rather than undefined ones. Bellow's next boxing painting, Ringside Seats, from early 1924, is a similar work that also depicts identifiable characters, this time from a fictional story. Both works do not feature fighters in action, but rather the events that occur prior to matches. This reveals how boxing was no longer solely governed by the scrimmage. Athletes had personas outside of the ring, and their pre- and post-fight actions were of equal importance to their athletic accomplishments. Bellow's preceding technique of feverish brushwork and his grisly rendering of figures no longer complemented the emergent milieu of the sport. His style has undergone a radical transformation. His forms have become sturdy, and his brushwork is more defined. He has converted the formerly adverse notion of boxing into a sleek, well-lit spectacle for the masses to enjoy. The approach to Dempsey and Firpo of 1924 displays another swift departure from the darkness and intensity of Bellow's former boxing paintings. This is Bellow's largest boxing painting, an oil-on-canvas work that is around 4.5 by 5 feet. Bellow establishes the viewer as part of the audience once again, but compared to his earlier paintings, the audience is taken aback by the display of athletic domination rather than ghoulishly pleased. The change in the audience's reaction reveals that the onlookers were no longer seen as bloodthirsty spectators. They have become viewers of a regulated sport, and they react accordingly to the display of athleticism. The ring is illuminated by bright spotlights, and the figures are executed with a new sureness of form. The musculature of the fighters is idealized, and many of the men in the audience are sharply dressed. The referee is distinguished and stylish. He wears a tie and begins the count. Compared to Stagat Sharkey's, he stands far from the opponents and does not interfere with the action. In Dempsey and Firpo, Bellows creates a composition that emphasizes balance and structure, which reflects the new, posh atmosphere of boxing. Fighters and audience members are no longer rebels and anarchists. They are upper-class men who can afford to spend their free time participating in an entertaining and popular hobby that is regulated and commercialized. Bellows' boxing paintings serve as measures of the illicit and lawful, presenting a comparison of the consensus of boxing before and after its legalization. In his early paintings, he creates an atmosphere of grotesque interest, emphasizing the forbidden nature of the sport. His handling of color and shadow, looseness of form, and treatment of the atmosphere denote the illegal status and social refusal of pugilism. The appearance of caricatured audiences and the obscured faces of Bellows' early boxing paintings contrast with the fully rendered and idealized appearances of the figures in his later boxing paintings. The later works reveal how the sport developed into a popular spectacle. Bellows' clean style and systematic compositions suited the newfound acceptance of boxing. His constructions of fighters and audiences directly reflect the public understanding of the sport and how this understanding developed throughout the first quarter of the 20th century. This transition from an intense and rather grotesque treatment of atmosphere to portrayals of polished and idealized scenes shines light on the complete reversal of laws and ideas surrounding boxing in New York in the early 20th century. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ava Botwin. Ava Botwin is currently a senior at UCF, pursuing a bachelor's degree in art history. She has been interested in the field since high school and is passionate about furthering her education. Though she is interested in a wide variety of time periods and locations, some of her favorites include medieval, 18th century, 19th century, and American art. Outside of her education, Ava is an avid artist, working in digital and physical mediums, and is heavily inspired by the work she studies in class. Currently, Ava is the UCF Library Special Collections intern and is enjoying learning about archival preservation and research. She is hoping to continue archival work after her graduation in the fall and is interested in pursuing a graduate degree either in art history or library science with a dream of working in a museum archive. Let's welcome Ava.
Magic, Death, I forgot there was a mic. Magic, Death, and the Vanishing Indian in Frederic Remington's Hiawatha Illustrations. In 1890, Houghton Mifflin republished Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's iconic 1855 epic poem, Song of Hiawatha, for the first time as an independent illustrated work. The Song of Hiawatha is a wildly famous tale following the life and feats of the titular Hiawatha, an Ojibwe folk hero. It tells the story of his birth, his extraordinary adventures, including run-ins with magicians, combating sea serpents, and multiple encounters with spirits, his romance with the beautiful Minnehaha, and his final departure. Despite the popularity of the poem in the late 19th century, previous publications saw the work either without any pictorial embellishment or in large, unwieldy volumes alongside other works in Longfellow's oeuvre. The republishing effort began sometime in 1888, and by early December, 27-year-old Frederic Remington set out from his Manhattan home to visit the Houghton Mifflin offices in Boston with hopes to illustrate their new Hiawatha. According to Remington's wife, Eva Catton, quote, "Ever since he has done any illustrating, he has dreamed about doing that, and now he hopes he can," end quote. Frederic Remington, born in 1861 in Canton, New York, is best known for his gorgeously colored American Impressionist paintings of the tropes and fictionalized realities of the Old West, a visual language still common in American culture today, high-action images of cowboys, Indians, gunfights, and violence. Remington worked as an illustrator for many different publications, including Harper's Weekly and subsequently Collier's Weekly, which he began working for in 1899, where he would mainly contribute a multitude of Western-themed works throughout his career. However, despite remaining one of the most famous Western artists today, much of Remington's illustrative work, including that on Hiawatha, has gone under-researched. For Hiawatha, Remington produced 22 grisaille oil paintings and 376 pen and ink sketches. The paintings would be turned into photogravure prints for the publishing, and 1 to 3 marginalia sketches accompanied the text per page. Of the scholars who have researched and discussed Remington's illustrative work, only historian Cynthia Nickerson has discussed his Hiawatha images in any depth. Even Native American historian John Coward, in his 2016 book, Indians Illustrated, The Image of Native Americans in the Pictorial Press, which has a whole chapter dedicating to Remington, neglects to mention his 1890 illustrations for Hiawatha. American art historian Alexander Nemerov, a frequent scholar of Remington's work, has written both a book and his thesis on the artist, and never once mentioned his Hiawatha images. Remington's work has an overwhelming reputation for realism, and though scholars have disagreed on if this reputation is earned, it persists nonetheless. Indeed, save for 3 illustrations, most of Remington's Hiawatha work is rather mundane, given the inherent mysticism and spirituality of the text. In her artistic interpretations of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's The Song of Hiawatha, 1855 to 1900, Nickerson posits that Remington, quote, treats the concept in a heavy-handed way, end quote, saying he was concerned with authenticity and unusually precise in his details. Nickerson identifies this as an attempt by Remington to work in a more formal style aligned with European artistic traditions, citing the Apollo Belvedere and Parthenon lapis as among Remington's figural influences. She argues he worked in such a manner as a means to not only further his reputation as an illustrator, but also to display his admiration for the poem, literally painting Hiawatha in a classical light. However, one thing Nickerson neglects to mention in her article is Remington's infamous and complicated views on Native Americans and their role in society, namely his dual admiration and distaste for nearly all Indigenous people. Additionally, Nickerson does not discuss many of Remington's curious adaptive choices of the text. In this presentation, I will be expounding upon the groundwork Nickerson laid and looking into the ways in which both the text of Song of Hiawatha and Remington's social Darwinist views impacted his illustrations, which often serve much more as anthropological recordings of native life rather than an adaptation of the work itself. In the context of Hiawatha, these illustrations are accurate to the poem's portrayal of a fictionalized pre-contact Native American life, but unlike the poem, they lack the presence of non-tangible culture. These illustrations assert that the Native American has no place in modern society, yet also work to record a disappearing lifestyle for an uninformed white audience. In his work, Remington strives to depict a sense of realism that is absent from much of Hiawatha. In Canto 5, Hiawatha's Fasting, Hiawatha encounters a young man, quote, dressed in garments green and yellow, plumes of green bent o'er his forehead, and his hair was soft and golden, end quote. The man, Mondamin, is later revealed to be a spirit or personification of corn itself, yet Remington treats his depiction of the spirit as realistic and physical. Surrounded by a decorative border, Hiawatha hesitates before a stately stalk of corn rather than a man, a smile on his face as he greets his companion. Much like his other paintings within the volume, Remington executes his figure in a calm and heavy manner. The use of grayscale allows the figures of Hiawatha and Mondamin to pop, the light starkly separating them from the dark background. Hiawatha's clothing and accessories, while not the focus, are depicted with clear attention to detail. This literalism within Remington's illustrations of the text can be seen in many other places as well. In Canto 6, Hiawatha's Friends, the strongman Quasin demonstrates his strength by hurling a large boulder into a river, yet Remington only depicts the aftermath of the event. In The Death of Quasin, Quasin is put to sleep while sailing and killed through the machinations of pukwudgies, little men or fairy types, yet in Remington's illustration, he appears to have slumped over and drowned with little mystical interference. In The White Man's Foot, two powerful spirits, Seguin the spring and Pebble in the winter, share the peace pipe together, bragging about their grand influence over nature. Yet without this knowledge, Remington's illustration would appear as two average men sharing the pipe. Unlike the text, little visual evidence is given for the identification of both figures. Remington's preference of topic leans towards the small, unimportant, and mundane scenes from the poem, rather than the main epic feats which are the focus of the cantos. This is in contrast with many other artists' depictions of the Song of Hiawatha, including Thomas Moran, Thomas Eakins, or Harrison Fisher, among others. Artists tend to either depict the romance between Hiawatha and his wife Minnehaha, or adapt the fantastical and mystical within the poem. For example, Moran's 1867 Hiawatha and the Great Serpent, the Kennebec, or his 1869 The Spirit of the Indian, both feature grandiose landscapes and fierce serpents or giants, respectively. Eakins' 1874 Hiawatha shows the titular hero swathed in shadow as the clouds behind him form into animals and beasts, elevating Hiawatha to the same level as the figures in the clouds. Several of Fischer's illustrations for the 1906 Bobbs Merrill edition of Hiawatha often show the characters interacting with animals or spirits, a common occurrence in the text, and are otherwise much more evocative of the poem's inherent spirituality than are Remington's illustrations. While it is tempting to point to Remington's fondness for grounded, or at least non-magical scenes, there are a few outliers within the pages of Hiawatha. The images for Cantos 4, 19, and 20 are the only ones to display any magical imagery. Canto 19's illustration depicts two ghosts, gnarled and barely visible in the dark, come to test Minnehaha and Hiawatha's grandmother Nokomis' generosity. In Canto 20, Remington depicts two similarly ghastly figures who identify themselves as Famine, Bukadawin, and Fever, Akosewan, and arrive to menace and kill Minnehaha. Canto 4 displays Hiawatha's father, Mudjekeewis, the West Wind, flying across the sky with hair alight, quote, like Ishkuta the comet, end quote. Even in depicting the magical, Remington still illustrates him as humanly as possible, with defined muscle, clothing, and posture. The main concern with these three images is death. The ghosts and psychopomps of Cantos 19 and 20 are self-explanatory in this regard, but what of Canto 4? Mudjekeewis' realm is the west, the direction which is often repeated within Hiawatha to be the same direction as the realm of the dead, quote, the kingdom of Ponema, the land of the hereafter. Mudjekeewis also tells Hiawatha upon his death to join him in the west and rule over the northwest wind, Keewaydin, something he does in the final canto, Hiawatha's departure. All of these illustrations serve to associate any traditional native spirituality in the story with death, an association which is absent from the text itself. In the aforementioned Hiawatha's departure, Hiawatha receives a white Christian missionary. Upon hearing his message of Christ, Hiawatha implores his people to listen to the man's teachings and bring no harm to the missionary and his guests before sailing off into the westward sun to join his father. The topic of illustration seems clear. From Currier and Ives' postcards to Albert Bierstadt's oil paintings or Fischer's illustrations, the image of Hiawatha sailing nobly into the sunset is the perfect image to not only convey the extravagance of the finale, but also to drive the vanishing race point home. However, Remington is more subtle, depicting instead the black-clad priest sailing up the river out of westward darkness and into a bright men manning the boat, possibly fur traders or guides, and any existence of Native Americans is reduced to material culture only for the use of white men. Remington's image suggests that we need not see Hiawatha vanish into the sun and join his father in the western realm of the dead. The coming of the white man is in itself an image of native departure. Taken in concert with the three images of a magical death, Remington solidifies his message to the reader. The only two options for Native Americans in the face of white colonization are death or assimilation. Though Remington was a social Darwinist, as was common in the late 19th century, he took his prejudice a step further, and his most infamous quote comes from a letter to his good friend Pulteney Bigelow in 1893, where Remington states, quote, "I've got some Winchesters, and when the massacring begins, I can get my share of them, and what's more, I will. Jews, Indians, Chinese, Italians, Germans, the rubbish of the earth I hate," end quote. Remington used more pejorative language. According to John Coward in his Indians Illustrated, Remington, quote, thought that pioneers and frontiersmen, that is, white civilized Christians, were at the top of the evolutionary hierarchy, while Negroes and Indians, among others, were several rungs down the evolutionary ladder. Indians could be admired for their physical prowess, but they were in no way the intellectual equal of whites, end quote. Coward goes on to describe these beliefs as a possible explanation for Remington's depictions of the Native Americans in his work as a means to, quote, capture the mysteries of these strange and very different people, end quote. In Alexander Nemirov's Frederic Remington and Turn-of-the-Century America, Nemirov identifies that, quote, Remington's writing and painting repeatedly referred to evolutionary processes he hoped would eventually leave all but the Anglo-Saxon race extinct, end quote. However, simultaneous to this belief, Remington was also highly fond of the Native American, who he saw as extremely tenacious and bold. In William Trutner's and Alexander Nemirov's article, More Bark Than Bite, Thoughts on the Traditional and Not Very Historical Approach to Western Art, in which they examine much of Remington's beliefs on Native Americans, they suggest that for Remington, quote, Indians were admirable, even fascinating, because they suggested the appearance and behavior of the Anglo-Saxon race itself in an earlier state of evolutionary development, end quote. This may be why Remington was so drawn to the Song of Hiawatha. The Native American as depicted in the Hiawatha poem is noble, stately, and civilized, being resourceful and full of vigor, while remaining submissive to his inevitable replacement at the hands of white settlers. Remington, possibly due to his conflict over his admiration for the poem and his hatred for its subject, does little to actually adapt the story of Song of Hiawatha. His avoidance of many of the popular or iconic scenes in the text produces a set of illustrations that instead depict Ojibwe life in much the same way he approached his other subjects, as a way to represent a believable reality, whether or not it is strictly true. Despite Nickerson's claims that Remington held, quote, first-hand impressive knowledge of Indian life, end quote, Coward asserts that Remington had very little contact with native peoples. However, the attention to detail with material culture may be due to the fact that Remington was referencing his own collection, as by 1891, the artist's studio was a treasure trove of clothing and objects from tribes across the United States. This collection influenced his artwork, adding a sense of realism to his images, and was, one has to imagine, also collected for more personal reasons due to the artist's admiration for the power and dynamism of native life. Remington's artistic efforts, seen in this regard, are similar to those of the artist George Catlin. Catlin, in the 1840s, proudly wrote of his goals as a painter of Native Americans, quote, I have flown to their rescue, not of their lives or their race, for they are doomed and must perish, but to the rescue of their looks and their modes. Yet phoenix-like they may rise from the stain on a painter's palette and live again upon the canvas, and stand forth centuries yet to come, the living monuments of a noble race, end quote. Remington takes up this mantle in his Hiawatha illustrations due to the precision and detail with which he focuses on physical goods and pre-contact life. As previously mentioned, one would be excused if, upon seeing Remington's work devoid of the surrounding text, his Hiawatha paintings did not appear to resemble the source material, due in part to his commitment to realism. Remington's grounded figures act as if the artist wielded a camera instead of a paintbrush, depicting the daily monotonies of their lives with little fanfare. Cantos which tell of exciting escapades and battles with beasts or magicians are accompanied by calm images of hunting, farming, sailing, and fishing. We see people about their daily lives, constructing boats, partaking in leisure activities such as games, smoking, painting, existing in the home, dancing, and healing. Battle and death are all straightforward and ultimately simple. This is all crafted with an eye for physical goods which accompany these events: clothing, accessories, decorations, tools, goods, food, all depicting a humble life within a romanticized pre-contact village. This level of detail is absent from the poem, as Nickerson points out with regard to the illustration for Canto 14, picture writing. Quote, Remington could take two lines and expand the idea into the study of two Indians painting on a stretched skin, complete with scraps of hide and the assorted tools of their craft lying at their feet. A quiver, a pipe, and a couple of earthen pots are included for good measure, end quote. Remington follows this trend in many of his images, taking a few lines and crafting a plausible yet evocative image of the Native American, which does more to record physical culture than to visualize the narrative. The paintings work in much the same vein as Catlin's, as a means to record and preserve the changing ways of a group of people. With a focus on physical objects and their use in daily life, Remington strove to inject realism into Hiawatha, and in the process crafted a lush, humble, and purely material portrait of pre-contact Native American society. Similarly to the naturalistic figures in Remington's full illustrations, the nearly 400 pen and ink marginalia sketches included in the printing serve to populate this printed world as well. Pages tend to have 1 to 3 sketches each, depicting an array of images, including moccasins, buckskin shirts, headdresses, leggings, gloves, beaded medicine bags, axes, hammers, bows, arrows, baby baskets, pipes, hides, scalps, jewelry, nature, animals of all sorts, small portraits of Native Americans, and, near the end, white men, among other things. These rarely correspond to the content of the page on which they appear, serving instead as what Nickerson calls an ethnological catalog, as a means to grasp and understand the culture of Song of Hiawatha's Ojibwe focus. These drawings are executed with delicate, thin lines, precise hatching, and subtle value work to carefully show reflection, shape, and material. Reminiscent of the precision and clarity of archaeological or anthropological illustrations, these pen and ink sketches serve not only to immerse the reader in the culture unfamiliar to them, but also to record studiously many different pieces of material evidence of the peoples they were taken from. Remington treats these sketches almost like a visual encyclopedia, attempting to understand indigeneity through purely material means, a struggle given his distaste towards the spiritual and mystical aspects of indigenous culture. Despite the amalgamation of several tribes in much of the sketches, and presumably the full paintings too, it is likely Remington's audience would be unable to tell the difference between goods from different tribes. Whether or not they are fully accurate, these marginalia drawings are important given that for much of the poem, the reader is not looking at Remington's full-plate illustrations. The small, detailed objects, vignettes, and figures all serve to set the scene and pull the reader into not only Longfellow's world of romance and magic, but Remington's as well, a world where the people and lives he was depicting were certainly doomed. Giving Remington's mixed opinion on the Native American, it follows that he would strive to record that which he admired in his depictions of them, especially when it comes to an audience already familiar with the tropes and conceits of Hiawatha. One of the main points in More Bark Than Bite that Trutner and Nemerov focus on is that, quote, meanings may smuggle themselves into a work of art without the artist being entirely aware of them, end quote. Remington did not, as George Catlin did, intentionally set out to record a group of people for posterity. However, in his commitment to a cultural realism through physical goods, admiration for the source material, and his own personal beliefs, his work displays a truth of which he was absolutely certain, that the Native American was dying. Thus, in his depictions comes both an attempt at revival and a yearning for the historical, despite it being at odds with the source material. Little thought is given to the poem itself, and instead attention is placed on the core function and themes of the work, which often results in a compromise. Native traditions carry on in the realm of death and in material culture. These ideas worm themselves into how Remington approached his subject, with the intent to record a disappearing society, rather than adapt the text of the poem. However, his attempts were hampered by his unwillingness to illustrate or understand any spiritual, religious, or mystical traditions which he viewed as uncivilized. Thus, his illustrations struggled when faced with both the poem as a story and its display of metaphysical content. Remington ultimately saw Native spirituality as a thing of the past and focused on purely physical elements of the culture, an attempt to record Native traditions for a white audience, despite the fact that the people he was depicting were and are still very much alive. Thank you.
Sofia Grajales-Soler is a senior at the University of Central Florida, pursuing a Bachelor of Arts in Art History, building upon their associate's degree from Broward College. They are currently gaining, what? Oh, do I have the wrong one? Of course I do. Thank you. Let's see. Gracias. They are currently gaining hands-on experience at Tyndall Art Restoration Studio, where they work across a board of range of materials and contribute to research and the development of teaching materials for restoration classes aimed at artists interested in restoring their own artworks. Sofia's academic interests center on conservation, and they plan to pursue a Master of Science in Art Conservation at the postgraduate level. Their interest in book art and paper making informs their passion in the field. Their current research examines Blaschka glass invertebrates and their significance to ocean conservation. Sofia aims to specialize in paper and manuscript conservation with the goal of working in a museum or library setting, and hopes to contribute to the advancement of the field through research and the development of new techniques in paper conservation.
Okay. Blaschka glass invertebrates, a catalyst of ocean conservation. Leopold and Rudolf Blaschka, a father and son team of Bohemian glassmakers, created between 10 to 15,000 scientifically accurate glass models of marine invertebrates and flowering plants in the 19th century. Their work transformed scientific visualization and the public's understanding of the natural world, allowing fragile organisms to be studied, displayed, and appreciated in ways that were previously impossible and, following their deaths, irreplicable. Leopold and Rudolf Blaschka's glass invertebrates helped pioneer the efforts of ocean conservation in academia by providing durable, educational, and emotionally compelling representations of marine life. Their later botanical work for Harvard University extended this philosophy, demonstrating that careful observation and artistic precision could cultivate ecological awareness and foster conservation ethics. Now, of the approximately 4,400 models created, representing over 830 plant species, over 160 of those species are considered threatened in their natural ranges, and 20 are critically endangered. Here, I will first explore the Blaschka's personal background, including Leopold's early exposure to glassmaking and his inspiration from marine life. I will then examine the glass marine invertebrates themselves, including technological innovations on glassmaking, as well as their influence on scientific study on oceanic invertebrates. I will then follow with an analysis of the Harvard glass flowers as an extension of the Blaschka's conservation ethos, discuss scholarly interpretations, and conclude with the Blaschka's enduring significance for modern ocean conservation. Leopold Blaschka, son of glassworker Joseph Blaschka, joined his family's glass business, where he began creating prosthetic eyes and jewelry. From an early age, Leopold developed a sensitivity to the expressive potential of glass. After the personal tragedy of his first wife and their young son's deaths to cholera in 1850 and his father's death 1 year later, Blaschka traveled to the United States in 1853, where he observed bioluminescent jellyfish and other delicate marine organisms. As he wrote in his personal diary, quote, "There emerges close before us a small spot A small spot in a sharp greenish light, which becomes even larger and larger and finally forms a bright, shining sun-like figure. 100 of these suns light up at a certain distance, end quote. He was transfixed by their beauty, writing, quote, "It is as if they wanted to lure the enchanted observer into a realm of fairies," end quote. Their translucent ephemeral beauty inspired him to attempt to represent the marine life in glass. Leopold was also influenced by the scientific culture of the period. Illustrated works of Philip Henry Gosse's A Naturalist's Rambles on the Devonshire Coast were integral to the creation of the Blaschka glass invertebrates and also popularized the study of tide pool organisms. On his return to Europe, Leopold focused on producing glass eyes, costume ornaments, lab equipments, and other goods and specialty items whose production was expected of master lamp workers. He married his second wife, Caroline Riegel, in 1854, and Leopold moved his family to Dresden in 1863 and opened a workshop where he applied his artisanal skill to model these sea creatures in glass, combining lamp working techniques with near-perfect attention to naturalistic detail. Rudolf Blaschka, Leopold's son, joined the workshop in the 1870s. Together, they perfected techniques that allowed them to reproduce the most delicate anatomical figures of soft-bodied invertebrates using molten glass rods, enamel, and wire armatures. This collaboration reflected both a family tradition and a generational synthesis of craft, art, and scientific observation. The Blaschka's work took place in a period of profound scientific change. When Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, the theory of evolution captured the public's imagination and transformed how the natural world was understood. Natural history museums, scientific societies, and the broader reading public became intensely interested in biodiversity, adaptation, and the interconnectedness of life. In this climate, the Blaschka's glass models of marine invertebrates proved especially resonant. Their painstaking replicas of jellyfish, anemones, and other odd sea creatures aligned with the era's fascination. Objects once hidden or disregarded now became evidence of nature's complexity and changeability. The Blaschka models successfully met the Victorian thirst for authentic visualizations of life's diversity. From 1863 onward, the Blaschkas distributed a mail-order catalog listing hundreds of marine species, complete with Latin names and taxonomic information, and shipped their pieces internationally. This system allowed for the study of these animals by making accurate, durable representations available to scholars far from the coast. The Blaschka's marine invertebrates were characterized by extreme precision, realism, and attention to the material qualities of life. Lamp-worked glass allowed the creation of fine filaments, subtle curves, and translucent bodies that accurately captured the anatomy of jellyfish, sea anemones, and mollusks. These precise works were so well detailed they were primarily ordered by universities, scientific societies, and personal collectors who were interested in marine life, all for educational purposes. Coloration was achieved with glass powders, enamel, and carefully layered transparent glass to simulate depth and tissue variation. The model's forms replicated radial and bilateral symmetries, tentacles, and reproductive structures with scientific accuracy while also maintaining aesthetic grace. The Blaschkas were able to achieve this thanks to the saltwater aquarium they kept in their studio, where Leopold cared for tide pool organisms that he would order from the coast of Europe to use as direct reference in their works. The Blaschkas' compositions emphasized lifelike posture and movements. Jellyfish bells seem to pulse, anemone tentacles curl, and nudibranchs appear poised on their substrate. Their spatial arrangement within the models reinforced a sense of immersion, allowing viewers to appreciate scale, proportion, and ecological interaction. These design elements bridged empirical accuracy and visual delight, making these models both educational tools and objects of wonder. Scholars have debated whether the Blaschka's primary contribution lies in art or science. Scholar and researcher Henry Railing emphasizes the technical mastery of glasswork, positioning the Blaschkas within a lineage of European craftsmanship. Ecologist and researcher Drew Harvell situates their work in the context of early conservation, noting that their glass models, quote, democratized access to marine science, end quote, and preserved species that were otherwise too fragile to study. One of the most detailed examples is their model of Physophora magnifica, a siphonophore. Rather than depicting the organism as a single unit, the Blaschkas represented its colony structure, which consists of multiple specialized zooids attached to a central stem. The model includes pneumatophore, the glass-filled float at the top of the colony, rendered as a clear or slightly tinted oval body. Beneath the float, the Blaschkas arranged the nectophores, propulsive swimming bells, along the upper portion of the stem, identifiable by their smooth bell-like shapes. Lower sections including feeding polyps equipped with tentacles, reproductive zooids, and defensive structures. These elements are differentiated in size, form, and attachment point, reflecting the division of labor characteristic of siphonophore colonies. Importantly, the model also integrates multiple developmental stages, which was uncommon for artistic renditions of this kind during the period. For Physophora hydrostatica, they included both mature zooids and smaller developing forms, illustrating the organism's life cycle. This attention to the organism's reproductive and developmental processes with mid-19th century scientific interest following the publication of Darwin's theory of evolution. Their model of Symposium purpurascens, a type of colonial hydroid, shows their approach to depicting branching organisms with repeating anatomical units. The piece consists of a central axis that branches repeatedly into smaller stems, each ending in feeding polyps. These polyps are typically represented as short, cylindrical, or cup-shaped forms with a visible ring of tentacles. The Blaschkas use tinted glass to indicate natural coloration, often purplish or reddish at the branch tips. The overall structure is rigid enough to support itself, but remains thin and proportionally accurate so that the size relationship between the hydranths, the feeding polyps, branches, and central axis can reflect what would have been observed or preserved in illustrated specimens. Because colonial hydroids lose their structural definition when removed from water, the glass model provided a stable three-dimensional reference that conveyed morphology more reliably than dried specimens. Their model of Ophiothrix serrata, a brittle sea star, demonstrates the Blaschka's ability to represent articulated skeletons of echinoderms, sea stars. The central disc is constructed as a flattened, rounded structure with faint surface patterning to indicate plates. The 5 arms are made from segmented glass rods, with each segment corresponding to the ossicles that make up the brittle star arm. Fine lateral spines are attached along the arms in regular intervals, matching illustrations and written descriptions from contemporary zoological literature. Unlike the more translucent Cnidarian models, Ophiothrix is typically produced with slightly opaque or matte glass to simulate the natural coloration and surface texture. The model positions the arms in curved or partially coiled forms, reflecting the flexibility typical of brittle sea star locomotion. The anatomical proportions remain consistent with the species' morphology. These different attachments were produced individually and stored in the studio and only connected and placed on a stand when ordered. Other Blaschka invertebrates follow similar principles: accurate anatomy, attention to color based on living observations or scientific illustrations, and structural stability that allows the models to serve as long-term teaching tools. Museums and universities relied on these models for instruction in taxonomy, comparative anatomy, and zoology well into the 20th century, and these pieces still go on exhibition for educational and aesthetic purposes today. Some species have experienced habitat decline, taxonomic revision, or changes in known distribution since the models were created. In cases where the original habitats have been damaged or where climate change has affected populations, these models provide a record of morphology and coloration of organisms that are too difficult to observe or collect today. This includes both deep-sea invertebrates and nearshore species susceptible to pollution or warming waters. The Blaschka systematic approach, producing hundreds of species across major invertebrate groups, also creates a snapshot of 19th century marine biodiversity preserved in a durable medium. Overall, the Blaschka's models demonstrate their commitment to scientific accuracy and their ability to depict anatomical details that traditional specimen preservation could not maintain. These factual qualities make the models valuable not only as historical teaching tools, but also as objects with relevance to ongoing conversations in conservation, biodiversity documentation, and the history of scientific visualization. Other researchers, such as Astrid Van Griffen, Catherine Aramine, and Tracy Owen Dreyer, focus on materials and preservation of the glass invertebrates, as well as stating how previous conservation efforts have affected the glass. Their work highlights how the Blaschka's innovations allowed fragile organisms to exist outside of natural habitats indefinitely. Alexandra Ruggiero and Catherine A. Larson examined the global reach of their mail-order catalog, emphasizing the Blaschka's influence on natural history collections worldwide. Taken together, these perspectives suggest that the Blaschka's work occupies a space where art, pedagogy, and conservation converge. Modern biologists have used the Blaschka's work as a reference for contemporary invertebrate research. Drew Harvell documented this in her book, A Sea of Glass, Searching for the Blaschka's Fragile Legacy in an Ocean at Risk, in which she and Cornell University used the invertebrate models as quote, time capsule to locate and compare the species the Blaschkas had originally referenced in the 19th century. Some of the deep-sea octopuses are thought to have gone extinct since the Blaschkas' time, as well as some Mediterranean sea sponges and corals that Leopold was known to have collected and kept in a studio, are critically threatened or endangered. Many of the soft-bodied species, such as nudibranchs, jellyfish, and anemones, were not well documented in the 19th century, and their current conservation status is unknown, as many of them are not tracked on the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List of Threatened Species. While many of the species have been found and are currently being tracked, the glass models now serve a more severe purpose than solely education, as due to rising ocean temperatures and lack of action from governments and bodies of authority, they may soon be the only examples we have left of these magnificent creatures. In 1886, Harvard University commissioned the Blaschkas to produce the Ware collection of glass models of plants, later known as the Harvard glass flowers. These models used the same meticulous craftsmanship as the marine invertebrates. Clear and colored glass, enamel, and wired armatures allowed the flowers to mimic botanical structures with exceptional realism. The Harvard Commission reflected the same philosophical approach as their marine work, to make ephemeral organisms permanently visible, enhancing both understanding and appreciation. Students could examine plants year-round, paralleling the educational impact of the marine invertebrates and reinforcing an ethic of preservation and observation. Unlike the invertebrates, the Blaschka flowers are much easier to track and therefore easier to pinpoint which of the plants are under threat or have gone extinct. One species, Brugmansia arborea, commonly known as angel's trumpet, has gone extinct in its natural habitat and is now only found in cultivation. Institutions such as Harvard, Cornell, and the Corning Museum of Glass continue to use the models to introduce audiences to species now rare or endangered. Harvell describes the models as time capsules of biodiversity, allowing scientists to study historical baselines of marine life and ecological change. Observing these delicate, lifelike organisms encourages reflection on fragility, stewardship, and the ethical responsibility to protect ecosystems. In this way, the Blaschkas' work prefigures modern conservation pedagogy, that permanent glass forms preserve not only anatomical knowledge, but also the imperative to conserve life. Leopold and Rudolf Blaschka created a unique intersection of art, science, and conservation ethics. Their glass invertebrates provided a permanent, educational, and visually compelling representation of fragile marine life. Their Harvard glass flowers extended these principles to botany. The Blaschkas' work remains relevant today not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a model for how observation, artistry, and education can cultivate engagement with the natural world. Their legacy demonstrates that the careful study and representation of fragile life forms, whether jellyfish, anemones, or orchids, can inspire both knowledge and conservation, bridging centuries of human interaction with nature.
Sulay Roque is a third-year undergraduate student at UCF, pursuing a degree in art history with a minor in humanities and cultural studies. They are first-generation Cuban-American that grew up in Hiawatha, a city with a predominantly Cuban population, where they were acutely aware of the turbulent political situation in their family's home country. Their research, conducted under the guidance of Dr. Carrie Watson, focuses on the denial of the suffering of people of color in order to justify the pursuit of pleasure and relaxation at their expense. Excuse me. Particularly how Fischl's work, A Visit from the Island, paints a clear scene for the viewer of this disparity. They plan to continue their education by pursuing a master's in museum studies, hoping to work as a registrar for a museum after graduation.
Hello, Eric Fischl, burying your head in the sand. Sorry. A diptych made up of two 84 by 84 inch canvases, each panel depicting groups of people in the shallows of beachy shores. On the left, vibrant turquoise waters and white sand beaches under a bright blue sky backdrop four white figures, three of which are completely nude, engaging in various typical summertime activities. A nude blonde woman sunbathes on a bright yellow raft, while a nude man between a small boat and a windsurfer looks behind himself, and a nude young boy snorkels in the bottom left corner. All the equipment looks relatively new, either recently bought or rented. On the right, turbulent waves under a gray stormy sky crash into a group of black figures, mostly nude or semi-nude, as they run for shore, 4 figures seemingly dead or dying in the shallow water. A fully dressed man runs with his back to the viewer, away from the pile of bodies in the foreground of the canvas. A group of figures in the background carry another away from deeper waters, while a topless woman in the midground tries to pull up one of the collapsed figures in the foreground. While the two scenes seem to be visually unrelated, the few similarities between both sides serve to emphasize disparities between the two groups. 2 figures in stark white stand near the junction of the 2 canvases. The young white figure on the left canvas, unsure and biting her nails, while their older black figure on the right canvas is in great emotional distress. Caught between fleeing the scene and a fruitless rescue mission. An older female figure on the left that lies nude diagonally on a pool float in the foreground is juxtaposed with a black figure in shorts and a red shirt that lies diagonally in the foreground of the right panel, slightly disrobed with their buttocks exposed, either dead or actively dying face down in the shallow water. For the purposes of this paper, we're going to work under the premise that the white figures in this piece are tourists from the US and that the black figures are Haitian immigrants. Fischl's work has been self-described by the artist as depicting the dark, disturbing undercurrents of mainstream American life, so it stands to reason that the left canvas would portray American vacationers. The setting of the left canvas includes bright blue skies, teal blue waters, and white sand beaches, all visual hallmarks of tropical locations like the Caribbean. The composition of the canvas on the right is reminiscent of descriptions of a shipwreck that occurred in October of 1981, where 33 Haitian immigrants drowned and their bodies washed up on Miami shores. The clothes of the fully dressed man in the right canvas gives clues to the nationality of Haiti, and his straw boater hat also typical of Caribbean countries' dress. Beginning in 1972, over 50,000 Haitian refugees came to the United States seeking asylum due to extreme poverty and government corruption stemming from decades of dictatorship by the Duvalier family. In the early 1980s, the United States government began to turn away these asylum seekers and intern them. Due to the United States' close ties to the Haitian government at the time, the people that came to the United States from Haiti were not considered political refugees, but instead immigrants looking for greater economic prosperity. This means that Haitians seeking asylum were often deported back to Haiti after being imprisoned for months at a time. At the same time, Cuban immigrants were welcomed with open arms in the 1980s with mass immigration, such as the Mariel boat lift. The only major difference between the people coming from Cuba and those coming from Haiti was their country's government, communism in Cuba, and authoritarian dictatorship in Haiti, and their race, Cubans being largely of white or mixed racial descent, and Haitians being predominantly black. This paper's aim is not to argue whether the United States handled the mass migrations of Cubans better or worse than that of Haitians, but instead to argue that Eric Fischl's A Visit from the Island reflects on the tendency of Americans to ignore the plight and suffering of others, especially of people of color, to further their own interests. Fischl's diptych forces the viewer to confront the realities of quote-unquote paradise and the inequalities between white vacationers and the inhabitants of the islands they exploit for personal gain. The choice to use Haitian immigrants to represent the realities of life in tropical vacation countries is significant because of Haiti's history with HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, and AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. The proliferation of HIV/AIDS in the United States in the 1980s was one of the defining characteristics of the era, at the time and in modern day. While the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 1980s is most commonly associated with the queer community and the prejudice they faced because of it, this epidemic also led to prejudice against Haitian immigrants and nationals, as well as people from African countries. Haiti was one of the earliest countries to recognize AIDS, its earliest case being in July of 1978, being recognized as an AIDS-related death after the fact. The stigma around having HIV or AIDS was immense. This, coupled with the pre-existing prejudice against immigrants and people of color, made the 1980s the worst possible time for Haitians to seek asylum in the United States. Paul Farmer, a medical anthropologist and physician at Harvard University, and Arthur Kleinman, a professor in medical anthropology and psychiatry at Harvard University, explained that the lack of sympathy for Haitians was because they were seen as a quote-unquote risk group and led to discrimination in housing, employment, insurance, and the granting of visas. Haitians were not at any more risk of contracting HIV/AIDS than any other race or nationality. They were at risk because of the poverty and lack of education that plagued the country due to government corruption influenced by United States intervention. During that time, Eric Fischl made a visit from the island. The HIV/AIDS epidemic had very recently been thrust onto the global stage. Just the year before, the AIDS virus was given its official name by the CDC. This moment marked a turning point in public awareness, and media outlets often amplified fears at the expense of accuracy. For many Americans in the early 1980s, Haitians were becoming visual shorthand for disease, poverty, and political instability, associations shaped more by media panic than by reality. Fischl's choice to depict Haitian bodies alongside white American bodies asked the viewer to reckon with two conflicting narratives existing in the cultural mind at once. One touting the Caribbean as an exotic playground, and the other defining Haitians through the lens of danger and disease. The desperate situation of the Haitian figures in the work breaks the illusion of the tropical paradise for viewers who would rather ignore the stigmas and hardships that Haitian immigrants faced in the United States. There is very little scholarship on a visit from the island, but Stephen Wright says in his article about Fischl's work in general that, in his pictures, actual events have happened, are happening, or are about to happen. Fischl's work, especially at the time, focuses on the realities of modern life, whether they're inherently compelling or seemingly mundane, and how they play into greater societal issues. In this article, Wright talks mostly about another multi-canvas piece titled Inside Out, made in 1982, a year before a visit from the island. This piece also deals with themes of nudity and pleasure, examining the ways Americans have become so obsessed with the image of themselves that they have become their own voyeurs, completely oblivious to anything outside of themselves. The figures in the scene on the right seem disinterested in, even unaware of the half-naked musicians on stage. They find little joy in their present circumstances, but make no efforts to make any changes. The pair in the leftmost scene are actively engaged in sexual intercourse, yet the person on the bottom still takes the time to adjust the TV where recording of people having sex is being played. The people in this painting have chosen to ignore the reality to maintain an image that they believe must be better than the present and hope will bring them happiness and/or fulfillment. The same can be said of the figures in A Visit to/A Visit from the Island, as they choose to ignore the reality of life in Haiti or any tropical island that relies heavily on tourism to find peace and respite from the turmoil in their own lives. The white tourists have no literal power over the lives or circumstances of the black figures Fischl places them next to. Yet it is their woeful ignorance, compounded by their want for worry-free relaxation, that allows the home country of the refugees in the right panel to be manipulated and exploited to the point where it's unlivable for a large part of its citizens. The figures on the right are literally tossed around and killed by outside forces they cannot fight against, while the figures on the left enjoy the tropical paradise, visually at odds with the reality of the scene on the right. This piece implicates the viewer as a participant in its moral dilemma. By placing the viewer in the position of a bystander, Fischl forces them to choose which scene, and by extension which reality, to give attention to. While the scene on the right is the most compelling, a heart-wrenching scene of turmoil and tragedy, the scene on the left is more visually eye-catching, with its vibrant colors and languid, idyllic forms. The viewer inevitably bounces between the two panels, their attention pulled in two such different directions that it's almost impossible to land on either. They must choose what they find most important, pleasure or justice, much the same as the figures on the left panel have chosen to ignore the realities of the beautiful tropical paradise they traveled to, in favor of personal relaxation and rejuvenation. The female figure in white in the left panel seems to share the same dilemma that the viewer of the painting might. This figure of a young woman is removed from the rest of those on the left panel, both physically and symbolically. She wears a sheer white t-shirt or dress to cover her naked body, and has pale skin with no tan lines, a sharp contrast to the tanned and reddened skin of her family. The young female figure is notably uneasy, biting her fingers, keeping her limbs close, and looking out towards the left. Is it possible she feels uneasy because of the inequality and disparities between her and the citizens of the tropical country she visits? Or is she simply bored, ready for the next activity to begin? Similarly, the figure in white in the right panel faces a dilemma like that of her visual foil, to take actions for others or focus on oneself. The older black female figure in white is visibly conflicted, her arms reaching out towards the topless female figure and half-undressed figures on the ground, while her feet stay planted firmly on the ground, paralyzed by what choice to make. This female figure stands out visually from the rest of the figures in the right panel. She's visibly older, one of the only two figures that are fully dressed, and is the only figure in bright white, like the young female figure in the left panel. The older woman in white stands out against the dark grayish colors of the background and the dark brown skin of the figures in the right panel, while the young woman in white blends into the bright hues and pale sand behind her. While both these figures stand out in the larger composition, the proximity of the older woman in the right panel to the viewer brings the issues of racial inequality and class hierarchies to the forefront. The visual differences between these two big figures do not exist solely to contrast each other, but rather to serve as literal representations of the dilemmas found in the groups Fischl focuses on. The young girl in white represents young Americans. They are not blind to the injustices happening in Haiti or any other country negatively affected by U.S. interests. They simply feel powerless. It is important to distinguish that Americans feel powerless rather than that they are powerless because they are making a choice to stay silent. It's a difficult decision to choose to speak out when it could jeopardize ease and comfort. The young white girl still chooses to come on this vacation with her family and is actively choosing to engage with her family's summertime fun. To choose to speak up about the government corruption in Haiti and the United States' handling of those seeking refuge from it may get pushback from the people the young woman in the right panel loves or respects, which could be too high a price for her. This dilemma pales in comparison to that of the older female figure in the left panel of a visit from the island, which is exactly Fischl's message. The older black woman is faced with choosing between saving herself, running to shore so she can be processed by U.S. immigration and possibly be allowed to stay in the United States, or possibly saving her companions from certain death by drowning, people she had just spent days, if not weeks with, at sea on a small, crowded boat. The choice immigrants have to make before fleeing their home country to come to the United States is one of life and death, while the choice for white Americans vacationing in these same countries is one of discomfort or blissful ignorance. Fischl's juxtaposition of the two scenes in A Visit from the Island creates a clear, unavoidable connection between the fantasy of tropical paradises and the realities that make it possible for a select few. The left panel's lazy, sun-drenched figures are wholly unbothered and mostly at peace. Their casual nudity suggests a sense of entitlement to leisure itself, leisure made possible by global inequalities that remain unaddressed within the left panel. In contrast, the right panel is overwhelmed by the physical struggle of the figures, bent, collapsed, and partially submerged. Fischl forces viewers to compare the two scenes, yet the comparison only accentuates how pleasure depends on the invisibility of suffering. In forcing the privileged beachgoers and drowning asylum seekers into the same visual field, Fischl shortens the metaphorical distance the privileged rely on to shield themselves from the geopolitics that directly benefit them. Fischl's choice of subject matter, white vacationers and black immigrants, as well as his choice to make this piece with two canvases instead of one, defines the piece as one of politics and the human condition. This piece was made during the precipice of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the height of injustices against Haitian immigrants, and a continuation of a long history of willful ignorance on the part of the general public. A Visit from the Island forces the viewer to weigh the realities of two very different groups of people who at their core could not be more similar. The exploitation of black bodies and exotic lands continues to this day, with most vacation destination countries still struggling with destabilized governments and weakened economies due to U.S. interventions, while relying almost entirely on mostly American tourism to survive. More people than ever before are opening their eyes to the disparities that Fischl reveals in his art, but to confront these inequalities means acknowledging the part we all play.
I hate to speak for all of us, but I will in a moment to say, we're really impressed with the work that you've done, the work that you've put in. We all know how hard you've worked on all this. The variety of topics or subjects coming out of your class, I think was fantastic. So really well done. Everybody slow down and breathe when you give a paper. All the same note for all of you. We're trying, we're hanging on every word. We need them. So you have to, sometimes you write it on
right? I'm afraid that you're going to walk around the podium and everybody's going to hyperventilate because you need these little short breaths. It just let us, because it helps your reader. Not for you, but for us. Like, I need a minute to wait, what was that last sentence? Because I'm writing so fast. I'll do things in order. I think I just have notes about, because I know that this is a very short version of much larger papers. And I know that these are all really well developed beyond some of it. But things I noticed sitting here, some different things than when we were talking, some things and some images and things like that. The Bellows, I had to look up, all I kept thinking was Francis Bacon, Francis Bacon, Francis Bacon. And I had to look to check the dates because, 19th, 20th century is not my period. All I kept making was little diagrams of the arcs and the diagonals. And I would say, check, because you talked about classicism. Sorry, you talked about, I know. I'm sorry. You talked about classicism. And all I could think of were the relief panels from like the Temple of Olympia in Greece, where you have these super strong diagonals. So you had all those great boxers with those sweeping diagonals with those legs projected on those relief panels. Because you brought up classicism, my question is, what is he seeing, right? Because they have all these sort of, where the bulls, right, are moving around the figure, and the figure cuts this big diagonal, and you have this sort of big body, and this, because I just kept making arcs. So my curiousness, because I know you said something about where that classicism is coming from. Just curious as to what he's seeing, because when you start doing that and you break down the sort of position of figures, it starts to look very much like high to late classical relief sculpture, in which case you have bodies and animals, or battles, battle scenes between two men, some armored, some not, that start to look really. Oh, fantastic slide! All the laws. We talked about that because it was so much to keep track of. I think the slide was great. Let me go legal, illegal, because trying to explain that without that slide, I think it was really difficult. I think the slide cleared it up really, really well. So I think I just have lots of notes. Oh, no, that was it. Okay, so I kept asking myself, what happens between 1910 and 1920 that you could begin to associate this shift from what I call those sort of the really sort of violent images to this more stylized version, and World War I happens. And one wonders if there's not some association to be made between really a kind of saturation that the public must have felt at that point with the kind of gruesome violence coming out of World War I, and a reticence then, post-World War I, to continue to steep oneself in what would have been, right, the sort of barbaric images or information coming out of World War I, and that also coincides with it. I want to say a cleaning up of that. I don't know if that's the right term for him, but my wonders were, what is his association with World War I, images from World War I? Are there other artists who span that same time period, whose work you see do the same thing? And does that then become a point for you to go, oh, look, there was a sort of trend, early 20th centuries, pre and post World War I, where artists' work changed in the same way? Mm-hmm. Just, these are thoughts.
Yeah, I can't speak to other artists. I haven't done a lot of research. And that's like the goal, to do more research on boxing paintings and other artists. But definitely developments within World War I are mentioned in the papers, the other papers that I've read that I mentioned. But that wasn't my focus with the paper, but definitely more to be researched.
For sure. Awesome. No, really, really good job. So am I going to go down the line here?
Do you want to?
You want,
or do you want to?
No. I was saying maybe we can keep subject. We'll do one at a time. One. Yeah.
Okay.
Before we pop.
Apparently that's a mic.
Well, thank you to all of you. I really enjoyed seeing how your papers have developed. Amelia, yeah, I agree. The timeline slide that you made was fantastic, just to visualize. I did think that that you might just double check your dates, because what you were saying and the dates I saw on the slide, you might have had a typo there, or maybe I didn't hear it correctly, but just make sure that those are aligning. And certainly to Dr. Zaho's point, the kind of return to classicism that we typically associate with the 30s, but certainly Bellows could have been kind of proto in that interest at that time on kind of rejecting that. I am curious, often when we talk about Bellows and other Ashcan artists, we talk about the influence of their work as like newspapermen, and I don't know if there was anything there for instance, perhaps it could be evidence or connection between his interest in the news, right, and his interest in politics, legality, changing of laws that around pugilism that would have influenced his change in style, to represent that. But overall, I thought you made a really good argument that, others had ignored this. One thing you could say to Dr. Zaho's point about the classicism, if you just soften it a little bit, like, well, this is certainly true, one area that could also be looked at, right? So you don't have to disagree with the classicism and the style in order to add the law part that you, I think, is a really great, original contribution. You might think about your development of the, racism, xenophobia, nationalism, immigration, and you could connect that to immigration laws and other things that are going on. Two tiny little things. I don't think Puritan is the word I would use because it's so much later. I might say national xenophobia or waspiness or something that would be more early 20th century, right? And same with posh. Like that's a very kind of British word to use. I don't, and the same with sometimes people say like bourgeoisie when we're talking about American. That's not that. Maybe you're talking about that in French, like impressionism. So just very small, like kind of word choice things, but really excellent work. So congratulations. Okay, so now.
No, I'm not going to pick on.
Not participating. Okay.
We're not picking on
I'm just going to say, we talk so much in our Zoom meetings, but I just want to know where the future is for these papers. So that's my main thing, but I'll give it back to Dr. Zaho. But I want you to think beyond the symposium to do, for example, you could do the SUNY Symposium. There's various undergraduate symposiums all around Florida, Georgia, and that's where I will bother you in private about that.
Writing samples for graduate applications.
Yes.
Oh, this is me again.
I like pushing.
Okay, Ava, I have all kinds of notes because my top note on the top of the page says, I still don't know, is Remington a Catholic, a Protestant, or an atheist?
I looked it up, and I think he was like a weird non-denominational. There was no strict evidence.
Right. Well, I think that matters. I think that even if that becomes a footnote, because if sort of breaking it all down, if his intention to somehow remain removed from the spirituality aspect of it is a reflection of his own lack of spirituality or understanding thereof, or religious principles or doctrines, that just simply supports your argument that exactly that there is a definitive choice, it appears in his work, that he avoids the kind of mystical things that make that poem sort of so lush and rich, and that's kind of stripped of it. My notes to you say breathe.
And we've been practice breathing.
Yeah. And then it just, as you're talking, I kept thinking this is, sort of that typical, it begins to feel very much like the typical sort of, for lack of a better term, that sort of white savior complex. He's by doing this, right? I save these poor wretches from distinct. What is it?
No, take things.
When they go distinct. Thank you. Oh, Jiminy Craig, I was going to do it in Italian, I couldn't get there. And that this becomes to feel like a mission for him, right? That this isn't just about art making, and it isn't just about sketch making, but which again, it brings me back to, is he Catholic, Protestant, or atheist? This almost becomes a complex in this sort of aspect, because again, before we met, I had no idea that he was, his political views, what they were. I like that you brought in sort of that encyclopedic aspect of things, because I still think that's exactly what drives a lot of this. So yeah, I have a lot. You answered pretty much everything that we had when we talked about it. I love it. Great job. Thanks.
Yes, is that right? Okay.
For the recording. It's for the recording on YouTube.
How are we doing? Are we doing this correctly? I'm looking at the recorder. Ava, thank you. Yes, I would just second that very bold to take on Remington, right, who is a difficult figure. It's very hard from our position now sometimes to look back and talk about people who made art and have been incredibly popular and are still incredibly popular with kind of Western art enthusiasts, but also are very challenging from a scholarly position, and that their values are vastly different than some values today. You didn't just take on Remington, though. You also took on Alexander Nemerov and Will Trutner. So that is just really very brave and commendable. And so I think you did an excellent job. One thing only because this is a real hot topic right now, is Edmonia Lewis with a big blockbuster show at the PEM, catalogs, retrospectives, many panels at CAA this year. You might put in her Hiawatha and Minnehaha and discuss also, because that would have loomed large as well in his imagination in the representations of those figures. So a little bit more just comparanda on how others are dealing. You did have some, of course, Moran and Akins, so very good. But since those are both just other white men, like Remington, to include a Black Indigenous woman and her representations might offer a nice foil for you as well. Yeah. And yeah, that very good. And I will second Dr. Clun. I've forwarded some CFPs to you all, and I do encourage you to continue to present your work beyond our walls as well. So.
Quick question. The borders around the pages with the little sketches, are they as clearly sort of defined from images that he's working with here, or are those more sort of, I want to say white folk stylized versions of design elements that come from Native American?
I'm not sure. He does a couple of the little marginalia sketches that are supposed to be like native like drawings and like images, and they look different, but there's like enough that's the same. I also don't know if he made those or if that was the printer or whoever made the photogravure.
And that would have been the question, because they read sort of weirdly. I wanted to call them Art Deco, but it's too soon. But they were very stylized, and I wondered if they weren't sort of like, like we talk about pseudo-Kufic and Renaissance. They wanted to appear as if it is of the period, but is created in a contemporary way without regard to what that was. So that was just a question. But I think anybody in the future, I would just know maybe some of those answers in case you get asked.
Are you doing on
Oh yeah, no, they all get me. They know that. Sorry. Sofia, okay. I know. Well, we know we talked about Dale Chihuly because I'm dying to see him in that vein, because aren't you? Is that you? Absolutely. Breathe. And then
to yourself or to her?
No, yeah, but well, yeah, true. I kept thinking how remarkably important it is that what other medium would have the sort of way that their glass work and the subject matter could not have possibly been more perfectly married together. There is no other medium, drawing, illustration, any of it, that could have come close. And so it's sort of this fortuitous moment in time that these two things come together and so beautifully manage to sort of magnify each other in a way that in other art, it could be done in painting, it could be drawing, but there would have been no other, because I kept thinking, could you do it in bronze? No, you never do it in bronze. Could you do it in, there's no other medium that could have done so. I don't know how you stress that, but it just seems that it's a point maybe worth making, that there is a kind of happen chance that pulls those things two together that makes them that way.
Right. A moment in history, because I assume now they're made
exactly.
of like plastics and polymers.
Absolutely.
Right? Sorry.
No, but you're 100% right. And then my other thought was, are they ever commissioned for anything private and different from this sort of, or this just becomes their total oeuvre and focus for the rest of their lives? Or is there somebody out there who goes, hey, I'd love a lamp? Do you know what I mean?
It was their main moneymaker, the invertebrates.
Sure.
And then after Leopold died, his son Rudolph did go into kind of a rabbit hole for the Ware collection for the flowers, because Leopold traveled to the United States with the invertebrates, but Rudolph by himself traveled to Jamaica for the botany
Okay.
class.
So there's no private commissions out there that,
I'd have to do further research into it, but their main moneymakers were the invertebrates.
because I'd love to see something made for a private patron used in a different sort of function, and if it's different from what they're doing in this sort of scientific vein.
For a little bit in the beginning, they were making costume jewelry and like beakers.
Yeah. But yeah, so I'm just curious as to I think that's. Oh yeah, no, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, for me, I would love for you to connect it also to Frederic Regent Church, Martin Johnson Heed, fern hunting expeditions, this kind of, heart of the Andes, this obsession with botanical specimens as well from around this kind of collecting colonial imperial practice as well, and how they're situated both in smaller landscapes pressed on the page, in scientific illustrative, catalogs, and then in models. Like, it appears to be all part of a interest in the catalog, right? The cataloging of every
knowledge of
of every species that has real resonance and connection to racism and nationalism and xenophobia, and an amount of scholarship, including a new book by Maggie Cow about this kind of, and many other studies as well, but on that connection that I'd like to see the Blaschka inserted into that history. Because I think most of the scholarship kind of exists in this scientific illustration glass craft space, right? And it could be integrated into that, but really beautiful paper.
Couldn't help think about Renaissance wax models for bodies, that it really comes in a vein like that, where there's this ability to sort of, anyway, more thoughts. Sulay, again, everybody's great. In looking at this, in those paintings, and you talk about, rightly so, this inability to focus one or the other that keeps viewer interest, obviously, and I couldn't stop comparing. I don't know if you've addressed, I have a relatively short list of contrast. We talk so much, sort of, when we talk about Renaissance and Greek stuff, we're talking about contrast of things, and not just the sort of obvious of white versus black and privileged versus non, but life versus death and nude versus clothed, and all of the sort of aspects as you go through it, I think becomes an aspect of the painting in itself. When you can make that many distinct contrasts, that the painting, at least part of its theme, is exactly that, not just the subjects as contrasted, but every single element in it. And then what unifies it, again, back to Renaissance painting, like those portraits of Guido Montefeltro and Battista Sforza, who sit in front of very different landscapes, but are uniquely and subtly aligned with each other. A common horizon line. There are some common wave that seems like it could blend from one to the other. There's the aspect of the nude female who lays a sort of akimbo to the thing, and who's cut off at the thighs, but then it progresses to the black leg in the other one. That there's some really interesting places where he has aligned it so that though it's all contrast, there's these really weird connections, like when the Mona Lisa, when the sleeve aligns with the bridge back, and she becomes part of the landscape. So I would just say, I think that could be addressed somewhere, just to sort of pull out all the sort of messages. I think you did a really good job after we talked about making sure that we address the fact that because of his statements, we can assume here American versus Haitian, but in a wider context, this is black versus white, privilege versus not, all those things. I think you did a really good job handling that. Anyway, that's all I have. Great.
Okay. Yeah, great. Again, congratulations. Very brave to take on a painting that no one's really written about, right? So you don't have any scholarship to go off of. So if you wanted to develop it further, since he is alive, I would reach out and ask him what made him make this diptych. Because, Okay.
Keep trying. Send me your paper. Because if he reads what you've written about him, that might get him to respond. You know what I mean? That's it. He might be like, now I got to talk to this one.
Well, I think too, because I could be missing some, but in my kind of review of his oeuvre, it's mostly white subjects, suburban boredom. The fact that he's chosen to make this painting, like, why did you do this? And even if we can't ask him, and also a caveat of asking him is, we don't have to believe the artists and their intentionality, but who's representing him in '83? Where is it first exhibited? Was it reviewed in any, like, a smaller newspaper of an exhibition? If it was exhibited, with what other paintings? What other paintings are being made at this time? So, for me, I think immediately of Serrano and the milk and the blood and this kind of work that adamantly is responding to the AIDS crisis at that same time. But other paintings that other artists are making or photographs or whatever, other work at this period, who's he responding to, and what? How does it sit not within within his own work, but other work that is being exhibited at that time? But yeah, really great work by all of you. Thank you.
So do we have any audience questions? So yes.
They're like, we're naked.
I had one for I had one for everyone. Ada, I actually really liked yours. I wanted to ask if, and I'm sorry, I'm a little awkward. I wanted to ask if you mentioned that he was fascinated by his own recreations of the people that he was doing. Was he more fascinated with his own recreations of them than he was the people, or was he trying to recreate a kind of narrative that was pleasing to him because it was more realistic and was stripped away from the spiritual aspects?
I don't know how into his own work he was in that part, but he was super obsessed with the poem itself. I don't think that he's so much into the subject, even though a lot of there was a review at the time where someone had said oh, Remington, no, he doesn't know Hiawatha, he knows the Indian. So he is more into I guess crafting this idealized version that is also in Hiawatha, but he does it in a completely different way, more aligned with his own beliefs and what he thinks should be happening, which is also what he did in his other super famous cowboy paintings when he does include the Native Americans. It's highly fictionalized, but he does it in a way where it looks realistic, it looks plausible. It is a heightened sense of reality.
Okay. Hey, Sulay, as also a native Floridian, I will say I did enjoy your paper as well, your presentation as well as your paper. I also wanted to just mention that you'll see that the kind of Western colonialism has continued, even in those spaces where those people, those refugees have come. You'll see where Miami has now become a mecca of white people. It's no longer as much as the artist collective of people of color that it used to be, because they've been priced out. So I guess I just wonder if that was also where your intention behind your paper was coming from as well.
Yeah, in my paper and just about the keys, there is definitely the idea of these people, I guess more that's in Miami, where there's more a lot of immigrants together, or in a way these white vacationers are immigrants, not permanent, they're just on vacation, to these countries, and kind of their perception of them in these countries is very positive. Of course, they spend money, these countries rely on tourism, versus the people from those same countries immigrating to where these vacationers are from, and their perception. And the visual, in the painting, the visual but also how that integrates.
No, I will note it did look very much like Fort Lauderdale Beach. The balloons, the beach, just the way it looked. When I first saw it, I thought I've seen that before. So I will say, yeah, that was a really good choice. Amelia, sorry, I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of comments. I really liked your paper as well. I also wanted to acknowledge that I wanted to ask, was the kind of back and forth between legal, illegal, also kind of going with like the prohibition and like the kind of unseemly personality that came with gambling and all that stuff? Post-war too.
Yeah, for sure. I mentioned it like super briefly in the beginning, but gambling was also definitely like really involved in boxing at the time, and like one of the big reasons why it was illegal. But yeah.
Sofia, as well.
This is more of a comment of just something I just noticed because you talk about the cross-section between science and art. And I did recently hear about the contemporary argument between taxidermy and how taxidermy are sometimes considered artists, but they're also sometimes considered like scientific recreations of living animals or animals and people who are no longer existing. So I was just wondering if you kind of have like any experience or an opinion on that when it comes to the Blaschka glass.
I think if we're talking about the fine line between scientific recreation and what counts as art, that we could probably be here all day, because today we'll see it as art because, we accept glass blowing more as art, and of course with Greek and Renaissance and all the classicals, that artisans were not considered artists until recently. So I think it also has to do with that, and that taxidermy wasn't really seen as even really that scientific. It was more for like trophies, specifically taxidermy. This was more for education, and even before he was making the invertebrates, he was making prosthetic eyes, jewelry, things that were useful, quote unquote. So I don't know if he would even necessarily see himself as an artist. He primarily saw himself as a glassmaker, and he said it in a lot of his letters too, that he was primarily, first and foremost, a glassmaker. But I think if I had to pick one, I wouldn't be able to, in between art and science.
That's it. And I saw somebody else that had questions. Can you give them a microphone?
Who is it?
I think Josh is close to that.
Hey there, wonderful presentation. I kind of came in halfway through, but I was very interested, Sofia, in kind of your work that you were discussing, mainly in the sense of going a little bit further with the understanding of like conservation efforts. I know in the beginning, especially like around Teddy Roosevelt, where like it was exactly what you said, kind of trophy hunting, but with the idea that it would then be put into like a national museum to be able to preserve kind of the natural landscape that's there. Within this kind of, what were the subjects that were ultimately their inspiration for creating each one of these forms is my first question. And then two, how does their process kind of change a conservation kind of effort that maybe obviously goes against a lot of that beginning naturalist kind of form of taking things out of their natural habitat, bringing them somewhere else, documenting them, and how has it maybe engaged maybe a different practice of scientific study that maybe doesn't just take animals out, kill them, deal with these things to be able to start creating a better like scientific practice of this as well, or human practice of it?
Well, okay, I'm going to answer your second question first. That
Sounds good.
I don't even know if he did it necessarily out of the kindness of his heart, because he definitely didn't have an issue taking these organisms out of the tide pools of even England or the Mediterranean. He had basically an invertebrate dealer in Italy. That was also at the time, it was called the aquarium craze. So you could argue that it could be for preservation, or it could be even argued that it's about the ownership over nature from man. So mainly the reason why these invertebrates specifically were so popular is because they were trying to put them basically in glasses of alcohol, but they immediately lose their color because they're soft-bodied, they don't have bones even. So they would lose their color, they would lose their shape. So it was more it was the best way that they could do it outside of illustrations as well. And could you repeat your first question for me?
The first question you kind of answered with answering the second one, which was where did they get their subjects from? I was more like worried about like the ethical practices of like taking these animals out of their natural habitats, actually doing it. But it sounds like it's within the same vein or history of kind of removing the subject and not doing kind of proper conservation of it in that sense.
It was actually, they would commission fishermen in the morning to bring them in, especially if they were deep sea, because they would come up from the deep ocean to feed. So you could only get them really, really early in the morning before the sun came up, and they would very quickly be brought to these basically aquarium warehouses and then be wrapped and packaged in seaweed and then shipped to their workshop or whoever ordered them. And then they were kept in a saltwater aquarium. And it was the same for, well, obviously they probably couldn't be shipped to the Americas from the Mediterranean, but it was easier for them in Dresden.
Perfect. Thank you.
No problem.
I just have one for Ava. I found it really interesting that Remington was a popular artist, but his art in the book went so like understudied. Do you think the reason that it wasn't really studied was because it kind of paled in comparison, like the realistic like subject matter of his illustrations paled in comparison to like the grand story? Or do you think it's just kind of like happenstance, kind of like how the actual book, The Song of Hiawatha, despite being very popular, was never illustrated or really like produced on its own up until that point?
I think most of his illustrative work is kind of under-researched. He did like sketches for, I want to say Roosevelt, but I could be wrong. Well, there was a president that he like illustrated his memoir for or something. And I haven't seen a lot of scholarship on almost any of his illustrations. A lot of people, and like less now, but like especially artists at the time, they wanted to be painters instead of like illustrators. Illustrators wasn't really seen as doing like art stuff. It was kind of seen like commercial, and it's not as like high as like making like paintings. And so that leads to a lot of people, especially not as much today, but in the past, like scholars, not as much looking into illustrative work and like commercial art in that regard until like somewhat recently. A lot of his illustrative stuff is not, it's hard to find pictures, the good pictures of them. It's hard to find people talking about them. Like I had to search pretty hard to find like Internet Archive PDF copy of his version of Hiawatha, because a lot of this stuff just isn't as committed to being like preserved and studied than his giant like cowboy paintings or like his bronze sculptures.
That makes sense, and that was not what I was expecting. I didn't even think about like illustration versus painting. That's pretty cool. I don't have the
Are there any more questions? One here. Thank you.
I have one for Ava and then one for Sofia. Specifically, in terms of the artist's Western collection, in terms of like cowboys and those depictions alongside Native Americans, in those depictions, were Native Americans largely a background force, or did they ever take the forefront of that?
In some, they're a background force, and they're just like, there's one where he has a bunch of cowboys like defending a water hole from like nameless figural like natives in the background. But in others, he did put more focus on like them as subjects, and it's just purely them. I don't know if it would be a 50-50 split, but he does have like a good amount that is just purely focused on like native subjects without any of the like cowboy stuff in there itself.
And I assume that the cowboy collection is a lot more, or is it as equally focused on like the mundane and the realistic as the poetry collection, or is it a lot more like bombastic battles and riding
like,
out west and stuff?
It's that. It's kind of kitsch. A lot of scholars kind of like discredit it because it's so like extravagant Western cowboy stuff, and they think it's not as like high art because it's made to be this like kind of cheesy like cowboy pulp stuff.
I see. Okay.
Highly collectible, which is
It is.
Fair enough. And then for Sofia, in terms of the like father-son duo and how even after the father's passing, the son continued on with his work, just focusing on botany, did either of them ever take any other apprentices or pass on like their craft, or were there any contemporaries or future glass artisans that worked on similar scientific depictions of different animals or plants or things like that. Because I've seen recently kind of a resurgence in that in glassblowing of trying to operate in a scientific capacity and create new stuff. But between then and now, I have seen nothing of that kind in my personal experience.
Well, specifically between then and the resurgence, I think it was mainly that they invented a new technique and kept that technique secret and then died.
The classic.
No, it's kind of like the same thing as we don't know how they built the pyramids. We have ideas, probably bottom up, but we don't know which of the techniques they picked specifically.
Got it.
And with the resurgence of it, I was told Dave Chihuly, he was one of his favorite collections is the Blaschka invertebrates and the botany as well. So I don't know, I would have to do more research into modern glassblowing artists that are doing scientific renditions of invertebrates specifically. I don't know any off the top of my head. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And a side question, is there any records of other illustrators or artists cooperating with these glassblowers on stuff?
Yes, especially the Blaschkas. They were not, I wouldn't necessarily say a pillar, but there are letters in between Leopold Blaschka and Philip Henry Goss, and also a contemporary scientist that I've forgotten the name right now, because of course I have. But they're talking about the taxonomy. So he was very interested in the science and the zoology of these animals as well. So he was in direct correspondence with a lot of illustrators of tide pool organisms, as well as marine biologists as well of his time.
Got it. Okay. That's it for me. I don't know.
Thank you, everyone, for
Oh, we have a question.
Sorry.
You're cut off.
I have a question. I don't know if this works actually.
Video, yeah.
Kind of. I have a question for Amelia. So when did George Bellows die? Because yeah, those are old paintings, so he should be dead, right? Sorry. Because I don't know much about boxing, but I know it got a little bit even more popular after the 20s, right? So did he have like any other paintings or like public opinions past the 20s when it started getting like way bigger?
Yeah, so the last boxing painting was made in 1924, and Bellows died in 1925.
Oh.
So it's hard to know if he would have painted more boxing subjects.
Okay. That was basically it. Thank you. Sorry.
Anybody else?
I have one. I have one for Amelia. Looking at some of those, especially the later ones, where you have this dark atmosphere, and especially in the crowd, a lot of the formal aspects of the paint handling, how the faces are rendered, is very much feels a lot like they're coming from the Goya black paintings. So I was curious, would he have had any exposure through either reproductions or visiting Europe or Spain or anything like that?
Yeah, so George Bellows never went abroad. He never visited Europe. But that's like a connection that's very popular to make. Like it's been made all the time, like for like the Goya faces and the faces in the crowd. But it's hard to know because he never went abroad. But they were definitely like prints distributed in America that he had access to, but not sure. Yeah.
So I would want to give another round of applause to the students.